What if you were in Uzzah's shoes standing next to the Ark of the Covenant, the very symbol of God's presence? The sacred object begins to tip, and without a second thought, your hand reaches out to steady it. But what happens next? What could possibly be wrong with such an instinctive, well-meaning action? The answer lies in the nature of God's holiness, a concept that can't be approached casually. How do you balance the tension between reverence and impulse? As you walk alongside the ark, you feel the weight of responsibility and honor. But do you truly understand what you are handling? What if your good intentions aren't enough? Uzzah didn't until the moment it was too late. The holiness of God is a mystery that demands more than human instinct. Could it be that reverence, more than sincerity, is what God requires? And what happens when the line between obedience and impulse is crossed? The Ark of the Covenant was being moved to Jerusalem, and this was no ordinary event. For the people of Israel, the Ark represented God's very presence. It had been kept in the house of Abinadab for years, and now King David had arranged to bring it to the city. Uzzah, Levite, was tasked with walking alongside the Ark as it traveled on a cart, drawn by oxen. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, but the journey held more weight than anyone realized. The Ark itself was a symbol of God's holiness, containing the 10 Commandments, Aaron's rod, and manna from heaven. It was not something to be taken lightly. God had given specific instructions on how the ark should be handled. The Levites were to carry it with poles, and no one was ever to touch it directly. This day marked the start of a sacred journey, but there was an undercurrent of danger that no one sensed. As the procession began, the people were filled with joy. David danced before the Lord, and the sound of musical instruments echoed through the air. It felt like a day of celebration. However, Uzzah's role in this journey was different. He was walking beside the ark, vigilant, knowing the importance of protecting it. His heart swelled with pride at the honor of being part of such a momentous event. But amidst the celebration, a moment of crisis was fast approaching. The cart carrying the ark moved steadily, but as it reached the threshing floor of Nacon, the oxen stumbled. Time seemed to slow as the ark tilted dangerously. Uzzah's heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, his hand shot out to steady the ark. It was a reflex, a natural response to prevent something sacred from falling. But in that instant, everything changed. Uzzah's well-meaning action would have dire consequences. What Uzzah did not realize was that his good intentions could not override God's command. His instinctive reaction, though meant to protect the ark, violated the holiness of God's instructions. Touching the ark was strictly forbidden. Uzzah's reverence and care for the ark weren't enough to spare him from the consequences of disobedience. The holiness of the ark wasn't something that could be approached casually, no matter how noble the intent. As soon as Uzzah's hand made contact with the ark, God's anger burned against him. The holiness of God was not to be violated. Uzzah's death was instantaneous. The celebration came to a sudden halt. The music stopped, the dancing ceased. Silence filled the air as those around stood in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Uzzah, the man who had reached out to protect the ark, now lay dead beside it. This moment of tragedy revealed the gravity of God's holiness. Even in a time of celebration, the sacredness of God's presence could not be disregarded. The joy of the day was shattered by the suddenness of Uzzah's death, and fear gripped the hearts of those present. What was meant to be a day of celebration had turned into a day of mourning and reflection. Uzzah's death was a stark reminder that God's commands are not to be taken lightly. David, too, was struck with fear. How could this happen? He had wanted to honor God by bringing the ark to Jerusalem, but now he was filled with dread. The presence of God's holiness had become terrifying. David's heart was heavy with grief, and he questioned how he could continue. What should have been a triumphant day had turned into a somber reminder of the cost of approaching God's holiness without reverence. As the oxen stumbled, the Ark of the Covenant swayed precariously. Uzzah's heart raced as he saw the ark, the sacred vessel of God's presence, lurch dangerously to the side. Without hesitation, his hand shot out to steady it. His actions were instinctual, a reflex to protect something so holy. In that moment, Uzzah's thoughts were on saving the ark, ensuring that it didn't touch the ground. But what Uzzah didn't realize was that this very act would lead to his demise. Touching the ark was a violation of God's direct command. The sacredness of the ark had been made clear. No one was to touch it, under any circumstances. God had given explicit instructions that the ark was to be carried by poles and never touched by human hands. Uzzah, though well-meaning, had crossed the boundary between human action and divine command. His good intentions couldn't protect him from the holiness of God's law. The moment Uzzah's hand touched the ark, everything changed. The celebration that had filled the air with joy was replaced by a chilling silence. Uzzah, the man who had been chosen to walk beside the ark, was struck dead instantly. The holiness of God had been violated, and the consequences were swift. His death was a sobering reminder that even good intentions do not excuse disobedience to God's word. The people around were stunned. What had just happened? The joyful noise of instruments and the sound of dancing feet were replaced by gasps of disbelief. Uzzah, who had been alive only moments before, now lay lifeless beside the ark. The procession stopped in its tracks, and a wave of fear swept over the crowd. Uzzah's death was not just a tragedy, it was a moment of divine judgment. David, who had been leading the procession with joy, was filled with fear. His heart sank as he saw Uzzah fall. This was not how the day was supposed to go. David had desired to honor God by bringing the ark to Jerusalem, but now he was faced with the terrifying reality of God's holiness. Uzzah's death was a sobering reminder that God's commands were not to be approached lightly. David's fear wasn't just for Uzzah, it was for himself and the people of Israel. How could they continue? How could they bring the ark any further when the very presence of God had proven to be so dangerous? The celebration had turned into mourning, and the joy of the day had been shattered. David's heart was heavy with grief, and he was unsure of how to proceed. Uzzah's death left a lasting impact on those who witnessed it. The people who had danced and celebrated now stood in silent fear, recognizing that the holiness of God was beyond their comprehension. This wasn't just about Uzzah's mistake. It was a revelation of the sacredness of God's presence. The crisis that had begun with the stumbling oxen had now turned into a moment of deep reflection on what it meant to approach God. In the days that followed, David struggled with how to move forward. The Ark of the Covenant, which represented God's presence, had become a source of fear. David questioned whether they could ever bring the ark to Jerusalem safely. The incident had shaken him to his core, and the journey ahead felt uncertain. But one thing was clear: the holiness of God could not be ignored or taken lightly. The moment Uzzah's hand touched the ark, everything changed. There was no delay, no time for second thoughts. God's judgment was immediate. Uzzah fell dead beside the ark, leaving everyone around him stunned. The joyous procession came to an abrupt halt as the severity of God's holiness was revealed. Uzzah's well-meaning action, trying to steady the ark, was met with divine wrath. God's instructions regarding the ark were clear, and even good intentions could not justify disobedience to his commands. Uzzah's death was not just a tragedy, it was a reminder of the weight of God's holiness. The ark represented God's presence on earth, and no one was allowed to touch it. Uzzah's mistake was not just a violation of protocol, it was a breach of divine law. The ark had been treated casually, transported on a cart, instead of being carried by the Levites as commanded by God. The holiness of God could not be violated, even in moments of crisis. The suddenness of Uzzah's death sent shockwaves through the crowd. The celebration that had filled the air was replaced by silence and fear. People who had moments before danced and sang in joy were now frozen in place, confronted by the reality of God's holiness. This was no ordinary event. They had witnessed divine judgment, and the weight of it was overwhelming. The fear of God gripped the hearts of the people as they realized that approaching his presence required absolute reverence. David, too, was deeply affected. His heart sank as he saw Uzzah fall lifeless beside the ark. David had desired to honor God by bringing the ark to Jerusalem, but now he was faced with the terrifying reality of God's judgment. Uzzah's death was a painful reminder that God's holiness was not something to be taken lightly. David's excitement turned into dread as he questioned how to move forward. How could he bring the ark to Jerusalem without invoking God's wrath again? The ark, which had been a symbol of God's favor and blessing, now felt dangerous. David's joy turned to fear as he realized the gravity of what had happened. How could the Ark of the Covenant be moved safely? The procession stopped, and David decided to leave the ark at the house of Obed-Edom. He needed time to reflect on the magnitude of God's holiness and to understand the proper way to handle such a sacred object. Uzzah's death left David and the people of Israel with a sobering lesson about God's holiness. The ark represented God's presence among them, but it was also a reminder that his presence came with conditions. Uzzah's well-meaning actions could not save him from the consequences of violating God's command. This moment of judgment was a reminder that God's holiness is absolute and that it requires strict obedience to his instructions, no matter the circumstances. For David, Uzzah's death was a turning point. He realized that his approach to God had been too casual. While his intentions were good, he had failed to follow God's exact commands for transporting the ark. Uzzah's death forced David to confront the reality that obedience was more important than good intentions. This realization would shape how David approached the ark in the future, ensuring that God's holiness was treated with the respect it demanded. The fear that followed Uzzah's death remained with David and the people as they paused their journey with the ark. The joyous celebration had turned into a moment of deep reflection. They were reminded that God's presence was not something to be taken lightly. The holiness of God demanded obedience and reverence. Uzzah's death, though tragic, left a lasting impact on the nation of Israel, changing how they viewed their relationship with God's presence and his commands. David's heart was heavy with fear and grief. The joy of bringing the ark to Jerusalem had been shattered by Uzzah's sudden death. David, a man after God's own heart, was left questioning everything. How could this happen? He had set out to honor God, but instead, tragedy had struck. The fear of the Lord now gripped him in a way he had never experienced before. He was angry, confused, and deeply saddened by the events that had unfolded. David's grief was not just for Uzzah, but for the entire nation of Israel. He had led the people in this sacred task, and now they were left wondering if they had angered God. The fear that had gripped David spread to the people. How could they move forward when God's presence seemed so dangerous? David's heart was conflicted. He wanted to bring the ark to Jerusalem, but he feared what might happen next. The weight of leadership pressed down on him. The Ark of the Covenant, once a symbol of God's favor, now seemed to be a source of divine judgment. David didn't know what to do. He couldn't leave the ark in the open, but he also feared moving it any further. The holiness of God had been revealed in a terrifying way, and David knew that he had to approach the situation with extreme caution. He decided to leave the ark in the house of Obed-Edom, giving him time to reflect on the proper course of action. As the days passed, David's grief turned into a deep reflection on the nature of God's holiness. Uzzah's death had not been a random act of judgment. It was a consequence of violating the sacred commands that God had set in place. David began to understand that this was not about good intentions. It was about reverence and obedience. The Ark of the Covenant was a symbol of God's holy presence, and it could not be approached lightly. David spent time in prayer, seeking God's guidance. He knew that he had made a mistake by not following the proper procedures for handling the ark. The death of Uzzah had been a harsh lesson in the seriousness of God's holiness. David's heart was heavy with sorrow, but he was also determined to learn from this experience. He would not make the same mistake again. The next time they moved the ark, it would be done with the reverence and care that God required. The time spent at Obed-Edom's house allowed David to reevaluate his approach to worship. He realized that reverence for God's holiness was more important than the celebration itself. David had been so focused on the joy of bringing the ark to Jerusalem that he had overlooked the seriousness of God's commands. This time of grief and reflection was necessary for David to fully understand the weight of his responsibility as a leader. David's fear of the Lord grew deeper during this time. He understood that God's presence was both a blessing and a danger if approached without the proper respect. Uzzah's death was a stark reminder of this truth. David's grief gave way to a renewed sense of reverence. The next time he attempted to bring the ark to Jerusalem, he would do so with a heart full of awe and fear of the Lord's holiness. Finally, after months of reflection, David was ready to try again. He had learned from his mistakes and was determined to honor God in the way he had commanded. The grief and fear that had once paralyzed him were now replaced with a deep understanding of God's holiness. David knew that moving the ark was not just about logistics. It was about acknowledging the sacredness of God's presence and approaching him with the reverence he deserved. The death of Uzzah brought to light a profound truth about the nature of God's holiness. God's commands regarding the ark were not arbitrary. They were a reflection of his holy nature. Uzzah's death was a result of violating the boundaries that God had set. In the ancient world, the Ark of the Covenant symbolized God's very presence among his people. It was not to be touched, not because God was harsh, but because his holiness is beyond human comprehension. Holiness is not something to be taken lightly. The death of Uzzah is a sobering reminder that God's holiness demands reverence and obedience. It's easy to think that our good intentions are enough, but Uzzah's story challenges that assumption. Even with the best intentions, Uzzah violated a direct command from God. His well-meaning act of reaching out to steady the ark was an irreverent approach to God's sacred presence, and it cost him his life. For David, Uzzah's death was a wake-up call. He had been so focused on the joy and celebration of moving the ark that he had forgotten the seriousness of the task. The holiness of God is not something to be taken for granted. It requires careful obedience, not just enthusiasm. David's mistake was not malicious, but it was rooted in a misunderstanding of what it means to honor God's holiness. Uzzah's death forced David to confront this reality. In modern times, we often approach God casually. We assume that our sincerity is enough, and we forget that God's holiness requires reverence. The story of Uzzah reminds us that God's commands are not suggestions. They are divine decrees that must be followed. Holiness is not about how we feel or what we think is right. It's about aligning ourselves with God's instructions. Uzzah's death is a warning that God's holiness should not be approached lightly. David's decision to pause the journey and leave the ark at Obed-Edom's house was wise. It allowed him time to reflect on the weight of what had happened. He realized that approaching God requires more than just good intentions. It requires obedience to His word. The story of Uzzah teaches us that reverence for God's holiness is not optional. If we are to approach God, we must do so on His terms, not ours. The Ark of the Covenant represented God's presence, but it also represented His holiness. Uzzah's death was a result of treating the ark too casually, of assuming that human effort could safeguard God's sacred presence. This story challenges us to examine how we approach God today. Do we take His holiness seriously, or do we approach Him with the same casual attitude that led to Uzzah's downfall? The story of Uzzah forces us to consider the cost of irreverence. David's experience with the ark serves as a reminder that God's holiness is both beautiful and dangerous. It is beautiful in that it represents the perfect nature of God, but it is dangerous when approached without reverence. Uzzah's death was not just a punishment, it was a revelation of the seriousness of God's holiness. David learned this lesson the hard way, but his story offers us the chance to learn from his mistakes and approach God with the respect He deserves. As we reflect on Uzzah's death and David's journey, we are reminded that holiness is not something to be taken lightly. God's commands are not just guidelines, they are a reflection of His nature. To approach God without reverence is to invite judgment. Uzzah's story may be ancient, but its lessons are timeless. We are called to approach God with awe, reverence, and obedience, understanding that His holiness is not to be violated. David's time of reflection at Obed-Edom's house was transformative. He realized that the joy of bringing the ark to Jerusalem had overshadowed the reverence required for such a sacred task. After months of careful consideration, David knew that the ark could not be moved without following God's exact instructions. He gathered the Levites and instructed them on how to carry the ark properly. This time there would be no shortcuts. God's holiness demanded absolute obedience. When the day finally came to move the ark again, the atmosphere was different. Gone were the carefree celebrations of before. This time there was a solemn reverence in the air. The Levites carried the ark on poles, just as God had commanded, and every step was taken with careful consideration. David's heart was filled with both fear and awe as they began the journey to Jerusalem. The mistakes of the past would not be repeated. As the ark was carried toward Jerusalem, David offered sacrifices to the Lord. Every 6 steps, he paused to make an offering, acknowledging the holiness of God and the seriousness of the task at hand. David's approach had changed completely. What had once been a joyful celebration was now a reverent procession, filled with deep respect for God's commands. David had learned that reverence and obedience must come before celebration. David himself was transformed by the events surrounding Uzzah's death. He realized that while God desires joy and worship, these must always be rooted in a deep respect for His holiness. The ark was no ordinary object. It was a manifestation of God's presence on earth, and it had to be treated as such. This time, David led the procession with humility, acknowledging God's sovereignty and the sacredness of the task. When the ark finally reached Jerusalem, there was an outpouring of joy, but it was different from before. The people danced and sang, but the reverence they had learned was evident in their worship. David himself danced before the Lord, but his heart was filled with awe. He had learned that true worship involves both celebration and reverence. The presence of the ark in Jerusalem was not just a victory, it was a reminder of God's holy nature. David's decision to follow God's commands precisely was rewarded. The ark was safely brought into Jerusalem, and God's blessing rested on the city. The people rejoiced, knowing that the presence of the ark symbolized God's favor. But they also remembered Uzzah's death, a sobering reminder that God's holiness must never be taken lightly. The story of Uzzah, would remain a lesson for future generations about the importance of obedience. The reverence restored in Israel's worship had a lasting impact. David's reign was marked by a deeper understanding of what it meant to honor God. The story of the ark's journey to Jerusalem became a symbol of how God's people must approach him. With joy, yes, but also with fear and trembling. The death of Uzzah, though tragic, brought a renewed sense of holiness to Israel's relationship with God. In the end, the ark's arrival in Jerusalem marked not only the fulfillment of a long journey, but also the transformation of a nation's understanding of God's holiness. The reverence that had been lost was restored, and Israel's worship of God became deeper, richer, and more meaningful. David had learned a valuable lesson, and through his leadership, the people of Israel were reminded that God's holiness demands both joy and obedience. The story of Uzzah offers a profound lesson for modern readers. It challenges us to reflect on how we approach God in our own lives. In a world where reverence for the sacred is often lost, Uzzah's story reminds us that God's holiness is not to be taken lightly. Are we guilty of approaching God too casually, assuming that our good intentions are enough? Uzzah's tragic mistake forces us to confront the reality that sincerity does not override obedience. In today's world, it's easy to approach worship as something lighthearted, focused only on celebration. But Uzzah's story teaches us that God's holiness demands more than just joy. It requires reverence. When we approach God, do we consider the weight of his commands? Or do we treat him as something common, something that fits neatly into our own expectations? The story of Uzzah challenges us to rethink how we approach the presence of God. Uzzah's death wasn't just about one man's mistake, it was a message to all of us about the seriousness of God's holiness. Even in moments of celebration, we must never lose sight of the sacred. This is a lesson for both individuals and communities of faith. How often do we rush into worship without preparing our hearts, without acknowledging the holiness of the God we serve? Uzzah's story reminds us that worship is not something to be taken lightly. As we reflect on Uzzah's story, we are reminded of the importance of obedience to God's word. In our daily lives, we are faced with countless decisions where we must choose between following our instincts or following God's instructions. Uzzah's well-meaning action was fatal because it violated God's clear command. Are there areas in our lives where we are ignoring God's instructions, thinking that our good intentions will cover our disobedience? The lesson from Uzzah's death is clear. God's holiness demands our respect and obedience. We must approach him on his terms, not ours. In a world that often downplays the seriousness of sin and disobedience, Uzzah's story serves as a reminder that God's standards have not changed. Holiness is not something we can negotiate. It is central to who God is, and we must honor that in every aspect of our worship and our lives. In our modern worship services, we often focus on joy and celebration, but how much reverence is there? Do we approach the altar with the same respect that David learned through the death of Uzzah? Are we aware of the holiness of the God we claim to worship, or have we become too casual in our approach? Uzzah's story is a call to restore reverence in our relationship with God, to remember that he is holy and we are not. Just as David's heart was transformed through the lessons learned from Uzzah's death, so too must we allow this story to transform our understanding of worship. God desires our joy, but he also demands our obedience. The weight of God's holiness is not something we can ignore. It shapes how we live, how we worship, and how we approach the sacred. The story of Uzzah invites us to take a step back and reflect on the seriousness of our walk with God. The story of Uzzah is a sobering reminder that the holiness of God is not to be treated lightly. While we are called to celebrate and rejoice in God's presence, we are also called to approach him with awe and reverence. Uzzah's death serves as a warning for us today. Sincerity is not enough. God's commands must be followed with the utmost respect, for his holiness is greater than we can comprehend. The story of Uzzah, though tragic, leads us to a deeper understanding of the holiness of God. It begins with disobedience, a well-meaning but misguided attempt to steady the ark, and ends with a powerful reminder that God's commands are not to be violated. Uzzah's death was a turning point, not only for David, but for the entire nation of Israel. It taught them that God's holiness requires more than good intentions. It demands absolute reverence. David's journey from celebration to fear and grief mirrored the transformation that the people of Israel needed to undergo. The Ark of the Covenant was not just a symbol of God's presence, it was a manifestation of his holiness. David learned that the joy of worship must be rooted in a deep respect for God's commands. Through Uzzah's death, David and the people were reminded that God's holiness is not to be taken lightly. As we reflect on Uzzah's story, we are reminded that disobedience, even when well-intentioned, has consequences. Uzzah's death was not just a punishment, it was a revelation of God's character. His holiness is greater than we can understand, and it requires our utmost respect. The lesson of Uzzah is that we must approach God on His terms, not ours. Sincerity is important, but it does not excuse disobedience. In today's world, we often struggle with the same tension that David faced, balancing joy and reverence in our approach to God. Uzzah's story challenges us to reflect on how we worship. Do we treat God's presence with the awe and respect it deserves, or have we become too casual in our relationship with Him? Uzzah's death reminds us that the sacred must always be treated as sacred. The story of Uzzah is a call to restore reverence in our lives. Just as David learned that God's holiness is not something to be taken lightly, we too must learn this lesson. Our relationship with God must be built on a foundation of obedience and respect for His commands. The joy of worship is essential, but it must always be accompanied by a deep reverence for the holiness of God. Uzzah's death left a lasting impact on the people of Israel, but it also leaves a lasting impact on us today. It serves as a warning, but also as an invitation. God's presence is powerful, and His holiness is magnificent. To approach Him requires humility, awe, and obedience. If we are willing to come before God with reverence, we will experience His presence in a deeper, more meaningful way. David's transformation after Uzzah's death teaches us that true worship is not just about celebration. It is about approaching God with the right heart. Reverence and obedience must go hand in hand with joy and praise. The Ark's journey to Jerusalem was a symbol of God's desire to dwell among His people, small redeeming, but it was also a reminder that His holiness must be honored above all else. Uzzah's story calls us to embrace both joy and reverence in our worship. The Ark of the Covenant was a powerful symbol of God's presence, but it also carried the weight of His holiness. Uzzah's tragic mistake reminds us that God's commands are not to be taken lightly, and His holiness must be approached with reverence. As we reflect on this story, may we learn to honor God with both joyful hearts and obedient spirits. The story of Uzzah is not just a tale of a man who acted on instinct. It's a warning to all of us about how we approach the sacred. How often do we rely on our good intentions, thinking they will be enough? But Uzzah's story reveals the deeper truth. God's holiness cannot be approached without reverence and strict obedience. Are you ready to reflect on how you approach God in your own life? Don't wait for the moment when it's too late. Uzzah's death was a shocking reminder that even the most well-intentioned actions can lead to devastating consequences when they violate God's commands. How do you approach the presence of God today? Is your worship filled with casualness or reverence? Join us as we explore this profound lesson from Scripture and discover how it can transform the way you live, worship, and follow God's instructions. Subscribe now for a deeper understanding of how to approach the holy with awe and respect.